I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Drain the swamp.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Liberty Nation's Swamponomics videocast. I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor. This week, rent controls are back in fashion. Home prices are at record highs, while rents are approaching record levels. Suffice it to say, housing affordability in America is reaching crisis proportions. How did this happen? Well, it has been a concoction of years of underbuilding, restrictive zoning laws at the local level, pandemic-era ultra-low mortgage rates, first-time homebuyers scooping up supply, and homeowners refinancing at lower rates, meaning they aren't leaving anytime soon. But are rent controls the panacea to an ailment that is eroding the American dream? Not if you ask our special guest. Please welcome legendary economist Walter Block. He is the author of many exceptional books and papers, including one of my personal favorites, Defending the Undefendable. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thanks for having me again. Good to be with you.
All right, so before we gain your insights into the issue of national rent controls, or rent controls in general, what is your reaction to this quote from left-leaning economist Assar Lindbeck? In many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing.
Well, I think it's a great quote. I use that myself in my many of my writings on rent control. And the reason is that he's a lefty.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if Milton Friedman said that, ho-hum, or Friedrich Hayek or Murray Rothbard said that, who cares? Because, they favor free enterprise, and rent control is not exactly free enterprise. So who cares? But when a lefty says that, and he is a highly credentialed lefty, then you have to set up and take notice, or at least the lefties should, but they don't. But they should. So it's I don't know. It's sort of like the Pope renouncing Catholicism, or the rabbi being coming out as an atheist, because rent control and minimum wage and tariffs are like the three biggies of the left. And here's a highly credentialed lefty. He was on the committee to choose Nobel Prize winners. And that's his view. And I think it's wonderful that he said that, and that we can now use that.
So now the White House recently announced that it's proposing a 5% limit on rent hikes that corporate landlords can charge. It will be in effect for 2 years. Now, at first glance, of course, any control on prices would create unintended consequences. However, administration officials say that the 2-year 5% cap would not lead to any issues and could not be compared to conventional rent controls laws. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's probably better than conventional rent control. I mean, the conventional rent control is freezing rents. And, you're paying $1,000 a month for your apartment. Well, that's it. And no matter what the inflation is, you're still paying $1,000, and that's very, very bad. This is a little bit better. But I tell you, even if they said you limit it to 100% increase every 2 years, it would still be bad, because it sends a bad message. It sends a bad message to investors. Aunt Tilly just left me $10 million, and now I can invest the $10 million everywhere I want. And if I invested in shoes, there's no price controls. If I invested in rubber bands, no price controls. If I invested in real estate other than residential, like factories or shopping centers, no controls. But if I invested in residential rental units, I'm limited to 100%. Well, I'm not going to go there because they could lower it, and it sends a bad message. 5% with the inflation, the way things are going, is very, very bad. Not as bad as traditional rent control, where they have no increases whatsoever, but still very bad. And what this does is it's sort of like a red light or a yellow light against investing in residential rental units. But we know the more apartments available, the lower the rents, other things equal, and the less homelessness. So this is just not only shooting yourself in the foot, but shooting yourself a little higher up in your body. I mean, if your heart is in the right place, you want to help tenants, you don't want homelessness. So you should control everything else except residential rental units. Not that I favor that.
Mhm.
This is hypothetical. Arguendo. You should control everything else except residential units, and then all the money will come pouring in to residential rental units, and rents will come down.
Now, one thing I found interesting on this issue and from the reporting I've done is that apparently there's been a consensus among economists that rent controls, in addition to price controls, it's just bad economics, period. But then I learned back in November 2023, there was a letter co-signed by 32 economists who say rent controls are desperately needed in today's market. Now, rent prices are near all-time highs. Home prices are at record highs. So if not rent controls, what, in your opinion, can help grapple with today's housing market?
Well, one thing is to control every other thing, as I just said, which I certainly don't advocate, but that would be a possibility. Another would be to subsidize housing, which I certainly don't recommend either as a libertarian. I think the best way is just good old free enterprise. Just laissez-faire capitalism. Let the market work, and resources will be allocated in a rational way. But the problem of homelessness, rent control isn't the only thing that feeds into that. There's also zoning and unions that raise the prices of building new houses. There's also all sorts of regulations that you have to build a new house, you have to go through all sorts of conniption fits. So I would say if you're worried about homelessness and you're worried about higher rents, get rid of not only rent control, but of all these other impediments to residential unit investment.
I found it interesting. The Federal Reserve Board of New York published a paper a few months ago, and it talked about how much the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates, resulting in below 3% of mortgage rates, exacerbated the housing crisis because so many homeowners refinanced their mortgage to such lower rates. And of course, first-time home buyers took advantage of that and scooped up the limited supply. So it's interesting how Fed economists admit that they contributed to some of the problems. Now, back on the issue of on price controls, it seems like whenever there's a price inflation phenomenon, there are calls to implement price controls despite the history of failures. Nixon, of course, installed the 90-day price controls and wage freezes in the 1970s. Though what's interesting about Nixon is that even leading up to that announcement, he knew how bad the idea of price controls were. So with the White House now creating a joint task force to fight what they say is price gouging by corporate America, why do you think these economists think now would be different? What would be different from the 1970s?
Well, it's interesting. We have recalls for all sorts of things. We have recalls like maybe something is wrong with I don't know, penicillin or something, and now we recall it, or breakfast cereal. We don't have any recalls for economists. There are people who have a PhD in economics. You mentioned 23 economists signed on. The rent control is the greatest thing since sliced bread, putting words in their mouth. Why don't we ever have a recall for an economist who says that rent control will help housing? It's just crazy. And there are even Nobel Prize winners who are lefties who oppose the free enterprise system. And you have to wonder why doesn't anyone ever lose their PhD over favoring rent control or minimum wage or regulations or socialism or anything else like that? And here you have economists who are just misleading the general public. Crazy.
Now, one last question before I let you go here. End this debate once and for all. What's worse, bombing a city or rent controls?
Well, it depends on how many bombs. One little bomb, rent control is worse.
I think, was it your paper where you cite that Vietnamese foreign? Yeah. So tell us about that. Tell some of the viewers.
Right. I'm turning my back on you to try to look for my book on rent control, and I can't find it. But I quote not only the Vietnamese guy, but also I forget the name. Who won the Nobel Prize along with Hayek? Do you remember who it was?
I don't remember. No, I don't remember.
A lefty.
Easy right now. Yeah.
And he also has a great quote about rent control that the government's lacking courage and vision implement rent control, and rent control is horrible. And this is another esteemed lefty. So they ought to introduce themselves to each other. The lefties who favor rent control ought to be confronted with the lefties who oppose rent control, who are sensible.
It's right. Just before I let you go, you mentioned before about the PhD economists, and I did an article a while ago talking about one of the economists, Joseph Stiglitz, and he recently penned a letter also saying how Trump's going to ignite all this inflation, but and then back in 2021 he said that none of Biden's policies would ignite inflation. He completely missed everything about inflation. So yeah, I spoke to one of my kids' friend's father, and he said, "Why do economists keep getting it wrong? Why you guys said this, but the opposite actually happened. So are economists supposed to be prognosticators? What do you think? What do you think about that?"
Well, I think economists predict to show we have a sense of humor. You see, what economists can do is do if then.
Oh, yes.
If you put in a minimum wage and nothing else changes, then there'll be unemployment for unskilled workers. If you implement rent control and nothing else changes, no massive subsidies for housing, well, then the prices will go up. But we're never in a position to say nothing else changes. Mm-hmm. We have a word for it, ceteris paribus, but we're never in a position to say, to rely on that. And also, there are no controlled experiments in economics. In chemistry, you take a substance and you put half here and you put half there, and you put water in one and nothing in the other, and then you can deduce that the difference is due to the water or due to the sulfuric acid or whatever it is. But we're never in a position to say, okay, look, let's have rent control here and not there. And now let's see what happens. Now we can try to do this through econometric studies, and that was my PhD dissertation. Mm-hmm. But these are inefficient ways or ineffective ways or imperfect ways. Even the East Germany versus West Germany and the North Korea and versus South Korea, they are as close as economics ever gets to a controlled experiment. Mm-hmm. Like East and West Germany had the same culture, the same people, the same history, the same IQ, everything was the same. And then due to an act of war, East Germany followed one path, West Germany followed another path. And we could see which way the immigration patterns were, namely trying to get out of the East and into the West. So you had almost a controlled experiment, but it's not a full controlled experiment, because the opposition can always say, well, if you had the North Korean dictator running East Germany, it would have been better. And we can't say, that it wouldn't be based on empirical evidence, because it didn't happen. So even there, it's not a controlled experiment. So that's one reason why economics is weaker than other disciplines. And then, if we predict something about inflation, well, we don't know what side of the bed the head of the Fed is going to get out of tomorrow. We don't know if his wife will yell at him and then he'll do this, or if she won't yell at him and he'll do that. We don't know that. So again, I resort to my claim that economists predict the future to show we have a sense of humor. Look, if we could really predict the future, we'd be rich.
Yes, I've heard that. I've heard a lot.
Fantastically rich. And, we have a middle class income. I'm not poor, and the economists with a PhD are not poor, but we're not billionaires. Mm-hmm.
I think it was Yogi Berra who said that it's hard to predict, especially about the future.
Yes, good old Yogi.
And then actually, on one final note, when you talk about if then, I think it was also Harry Truman who said that he only wanted a one-handed economist, because economists always say, on the other hand, this. So, Mr. Block, I'd like to thank you so much for appearing on Swamponomics. It is a delight and an honor. And for all the viewers, Mr. Block is one of the finest economists in history and in the present day. So thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me. I'm a professor at Loyola University. I'm always looking for good students. So if you're a high school student and you're interested in free enterprise economics, come on by.
All right.
You all heard that. If you're young enough, do it. Even if you're old, do it. Doesn't matter.
Are rent controls worse than bombing? It is not hyperbole. Decades ago, Vietnamese Foreign Minister Nguyen Co Thach said in an interview, quote, "The Americans couldn't destroy Hanoi, but we have destroyed our city by very low rents. We realized it was stupid and that we must change policy." Despite the empirical evidence of how rent control laws manufacture a tidal wave of problems, officials never learn from the past. It is comparable to what legendary economist Milton Friedman wrote, quote, "Governments never learn, only people do." That's it from this week. I would like to thank Mr. Walter Block for appearing on Swamponomics. Also, be sure to check out my Swamponomics column every week on LibertyNation.com, and remember to view my previous Swamponomics TV videos and interviews. Thank you. I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Drain the